Hello? Okay, so thank you so much, Michal. Thank you so much, Yvette and Christina, for organizing this wonderful event and for inviting me to participate. And it is a great pleasure. And today I want to talk about the topic that I developed in two of my current texts that I'm working on. And both address from different aspects the decolonial strategies in new Ukrainian art. So I'm going to speak about post-colonial and decolonial applications in new Ukrainian art. Many of the works created by Ukrainian artists during the last 80 years reflect on post-colonial state and traumatic memories of Ukraine's entanglement with Russia before and throughout the 20th century. However, since Russian bombs began falling on Ukrainian towns, killing Ukrainian children and destroying thousands of Ukrainian people's homes, unfolding in the full-scale Russian invasion of the country in February 2022, the understanding of this post-colonial entanglement has changed, as has the attitude toward decoloniality in Ukrainian culture. Art is one of the indicators of such profound liberation impulse. Even though conventionally, one might consider that in Ukrainian culture, the current changes in the interpretation of the ongoing traumatic events are manifested through the decolonial optics. If you look at the dichotomy of post-colonialism, decoloniality, through the decolonial, from a paradigmatic point of view, as opposed to a chronological one, it becomes apparent that neither is a particularly fit theoretical framework in the case of Ukraine. While post-colonial theory predominantly addresses Western power and the discourse of modernity through the perspectives of former colonies, considering ongoing Western influence in these territories, the decolonial approach relies on the development of a parallel power structure as an independent alternative to the once dominant narratives, and mostly this theory is applied with a focus on Latin America. However, Ukraine and other post-socialist countries do not fully respond to either approach, having been at some moment of history as part of the socialist space on the periphery of Western discourses on modernity. Okay. To start off, I would like to argue that notions of the post-colonial and decolonial are not interchangeable in terms of the war and history between Ukraine and Russia. Rather, they reflect two different stages of liberation from colonial entanglement. While the post-colonial denotes the situation immediately following the colonial experience and anti-colonial struggle, rebuilding and reinterpreting elements of colonialism, the decolonial speaks about the final process of dismantling the colonial narrative. So basically, there are two paradigms which can be considered as two independent theories, the post-colonial and the decolonial. But also we can apply them simultaneously in some cases, and in those cases, we speak in the first case about the reinterpretation of the legacy of colonialism, and in the second case of decolonial, we speak about the release from this legacy. The colonial researcher Madina Tlastanova remarks on the chronological and logical discrepancies between the two approaches. The post-colonial condition is more of an objective given, a geopolitical and geohistorical situation of many people coming from former colonies. The decolonial stance is one step further, as it involves a conscious choice of how to interpret reality and how to act upon it. The atrocities of the anachronistic Russian war of aggression have brought Ukraine to the culmination of its decolonial stage, with the once dominating narrative of Russian culture enveloping Ukrainian culture having fallen apart to the point of no return. Indeed, any further aggressive action on the part of Russia toward Ukraine will only continue to foster what is an inevitable shift. We observe a very different process in Russia, where ongoing Ukrainian disentanglement provokes Russian obsession not only with Ukrainian territory, but also with the minds and souls of Ukrainian people. In this Russian pursuit of the unachievable, the war represents a notorious case of self-colonization, in which Russia has emotionally aligned itself with culture and geographical space to which it has no right. To defend self-colonization, literary critic Alexander Kosev speaks about hegemony without domination, That is when a country voluntarily succumbs to the symbolical power of another country, without having been in fact invaded and colonized. As recent events show, Ukraine has assumed a dominant role in Russia's political imagination, with the propaganda machine repeatedly suggesting the existential threat that Ukraine poses to Russia, and the war that manifests Russia's obsession with Ukraine. The latest events of extreme violence are rooted, however, in the events of the occupation by Russia of a part of Ukrainian territory in 2014. Therefore, to see a fuller perspective on the issues of colonialism, I need to begin with the works produced between 2014 and 2021. Okay. Here we have a work that reflects varying points of view on violence. It is called Blind Spot by Mykola Ridny. In this series of photographs of a building in eastern Ukraine heavily damaged by Russian shelling, a circular blind spot, a black ink blot, obscures a significant part of every image. While in some works, the extent of the destruction is covered in ink and thus no longer visible, permitting only the surrounding landscape to be seen, in others, the rubble is visible though seemingly removed from its surrounding context. In the version of the project realized together with Ukrainian poet Sergei Zhadan on a large banner partially covering a building in Berlin, the image to the left, a small circular view of rubble from a destroyed building in Luhansk seems to float, untethered in a field of black. Ridny visually addresses the gradual loss of visibility, of violence and voluntary societal blindness to traumatic war events. Zhadan, in his text accompanying the image, uses words to address the theme of destruction, recalling the bombing of a museum in Donetsk in 2014 and pointing out that the devastation of buildings and cultural heritage rarely stays in the public memory of those who didn't inhabit the place in which it occurred. This work can also be read in a more general way, as a metaphor for the invisibility of evil as a post-colonial condition, or more specifically for the fact that the peripheral territories in eastern Ukraine were not considered of ultimate importance when war broke out there in 2014. In 2022, however, it has become clear that the events of the topic of the war in the East didn't resolve the problem, but made it rather deeper. Indeed, the crimes hidden behind blind spots are now in plain sight. Artist and writer Evgenia Belarusets produced daily dispatches from wartime Kiev, which she began posting amid the full-scale invasion in February 2022. They present a human view of the horrors in which the city and its surroundings have been immersed since the beginning of the Russian attacks. Quoting, in the evening, I learned that a friend of mine was evacuated from the small town of Irpin, northwest of Kiev. On the way, she lost her dog, who was frightened by the explosions and ran off in a panic. She saw with her own eyes how women with children were being targeted as they tried to get on an evacuation bus. Then something heavy crashed to the ground not far from them, a bomb perhaps, and everybody on the bus was knocked over. My friend told me, I want to survive so that I can describe this evacuation in The Hague. Some were murdered during the evacuation. The estimate so far is 6 women and children, but the exact number of victims and injured is still being clarified. This diary excerpt exemplifies observation and reporting in which there are no blind spots, no ambivalence of vision, as Ukraine and the world clearly see the Russian war crimes, including the killing of civilians. Okay. The use of language in the context of the Russian war against Ukraine is discussed in the work War in Ukraine by Lada Nakonechna from 2015, to the left. The artist produced a series of typed texts in which she explores how language structures are conditioned by particular political positions and modes of thinking. Small details such as the order of words or the use of prepositions can change the meaning of a phrase. In every example, the artist uses 3 related phrasal structures, where the meaning has been profoundly transformed to reveal how linguistic clichés reflect underlying paradigms, such as civil, crossed out, war, on, crossed out, in Ukraine, is the text in the middle of the frame. The armed conflict in the east of Ukraine, the text that appears in the caption to the image. in the caption on the bottom part of the frame, and Russian-Ukrainian War. This is the title of this particular work. The way these phrases are constructed makes clear the points of view from which they're generated. The way they distinguish between the subject and object of aggression and expose particular ideas either promoted by Russian propaganda or conventionally accepted by the Ukrainian mass media. These phrases are not related to the specific use of the Ukrainian or Russian language. Rather, the syntax and vocabulary form the intended meaning. Another work by Nakonechna, the so-called, to the right, uses stones to speak about the labeling of the sites and the media confrontations that occurred throughout the traumatic events of 2014, with the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of Russian occupation. The stones are wrapped in paper with hand-printed words referring to the opposing sides of the conflict. One of them being pro-Ukrainian media, another being the pro-Russian propaganda that was still active in Ukraine at that time. They insulted the two sides metaphorically threw at each other as stones were neo-Nazis, Banderovцы, separatists, rebels, among others. This work, as well as the serious war in Ukraine, gives an example of the post-colonial ambivalence that, as interpreted by critical theorist Homi Bhabha, occurs when the former oppressor and oppressed share similar features, and the once dominant culture infects its colonial domain with its own political identity. As the situation following the 2022 full-scale invasion has shown, Russia's strategy has relied on the assumption of existence of a similar type of ambivalence of narratives. That is, it was Russia's hope that Ukrainians would want to support Russian aggression within Ukrainian territory. The Ukrainian resistance against the invaders, however, confirms that mediatic reality is different from the real order of things. The Ukrainian people's heartfelt struggle against the Russian war is a testament to the fact that post-colonial ambivalence is not characteristic of Ukrainian society anymore, marking not only the end of the debate around ambivalence, but also the true birth of decolonial culture. Жанна Kadyrova's new work, Palynytsia, from 2022, speaks about this loss of ambivalence as it reverses the vision of bread as a sign of hospitality, turning it into a symbol of linguistic resistance. The word Palynytsia describes a particular type of Ukrainian bread that has been reportedly used to reveal suspected Russian saboteurs, who are unable to pronounce this word correctly. Due to some differences in Ukrainian and Russian phonetics, it has proven difficult for monolingual Russian speakers to spell the word in its conventional form. In western Ukraine, where Kadyrova was in evacuation, she set a table replacing the bread with sliced river stones. These stones are as unbiteable and inedible as are Ukrainian phonetics and Ukrainian territory for the Russians. This project also presents the ultimate decolonial gesture of inverting the theme of hunger, turning it against the enemy who comes to kill, and thus breaking up with the historical trauma of mass famine of Holodomor, caused by centralized Soviet government as a genocide of Ukrainians in 1932-1933, as well as the recent deaths from hunger in sieged Mariupol, reinterpreting food as an instrument of resistance. The hybridity of language is going together with the relevance of the oppressor's discourse among the Ukrainian people, who have witnessed untold violence, destruction, and death unjustly brought upon them by Russia. Another strategy in the recent Ukrainian art is taking one step back from the post-colonial situation and undertaking a seemingly anti-colonial perspective that marks active resistance to colonialist intentions. Indeed, the recent events of Russian aggression in Ukraine provoked a revival of anti-colonial resistance, yet these two further triggered the decolonial processes. Painter Vladimir Relko's recent work, The Dove of Peace Rapes a City, from 2022, merges drawing with watercolor painting on paper and reflects the full-scale invasion presenting Russia's coat of arms as a double-headed monster shelling a Ukrainian city, with skulls instead of eagle heads and with pigeon wings. Here, a destroyed city becomes equal to a suffering human body, echoing the rapes by Russian soldiers in Kiev suburbs. This drawing also reflects the violence performed by the two-headed eagle Relko depicted in her series Kiev Diary in 2014. The visual diary of the artist at that time documented what can be seen now as an anti-colonial struggle of the Maidan protests, aimed against the pro-Russian government of Viktor Yanukovych. The drawing depicts a male figure perplexed between the two heads of the eagle who attacks and abuses him, ironically reflecting on the myths of Leda and the swan. While the apparent violent intentions of the eagle in the Kiev Diary series is depicted figuratively, in the new 2022 work, the state emblem of Russia loses any anthropomorphic features, becoming a macabre machine of pure evil, responding to the atrocities performed by the Russian collective body, represented by the Russian army. The counting in the newest Ukrainian art now goes not by years but by months and weeks, as the works by the artist show in an impromptu manner how the attitudes towards Russia's colonization desire were changing dramatically as the violence was unfolding. Okay, Alevtina Kilkhidze's series of work experiences transformations within only 1 month and a half. The drawing, a self-portrait made 10 days before the invasion began on 24th February, depicts the artist surrounded by weapons. On the left, Kilkhidze presents concerned questions about her well-being and defense weapons as gifts from the Allies. On the right, she shows Russian weapons directed at her. The artist reflects on the situation of helplessness and uncertainty that marked the last days before the invasion. While the Western side is presented as figurative, with a human face, Russia is shown as a hostile, faceless entity aimed at killing. By showing herself as a target, Kilkhidze discusses the state of vulnerability that all Ukrainians experience at this period before the invasion. The drawing from the end of March, however, already shows Russian culture looking for an alibi that is not a killer, as another two-headed monster that is comprised of the figures of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. This hybrid creature moves forward to the west, with the cat of Joseph Brodsky in the vanguard, supported by 4 legs of Swan Lake ballet dancers as a kind of caterpillar. This grotesque depiction marks an intersection of naive art with a political art poster. This work resonates in its radical, anti-colonial expression with Vlada Relko's drawings, however, taking it further in a call to see the culture at the roots of the inhuman actions of the Russian army in Ukraine, and the popular support of military violence by the majority of Russian population. However directly anti-colonial this might seem, the decolonial impulse presents a visible manifestation in these wartime works, showing that the anti-colonial resistance Ukraine has been forced into is only a means for the true decolonial release. The interpretations by Relko and Kilkhidze, with a direct reference to Russia as an aspiring colonial power, are responding to the current violence and past traumas, as they remark on the gap that becomes wider even since the outburst of Russian violence in the Ukrainian territory. Okay. Works such as those by Ridney and Жадан or Nakonechna, which use ambivalence or hybridity of the relative positions of the colonizer and colonized as a moving force, are not possible anymore in Ukraine since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in February 2002. And Ukrainians fully broke with the Russian cultural sphere. All the controversies and diversities of position the artists speak about have been at once and forever erased by Russia's ongoing attack. Ukraine's post-colonial struggle is also gone. What Russia is now attempting to artificially present as a colonial and simultaneously anti-colonial war remains such only for Russia. For Ukraine, the inhuman war, however painful and unbelievably destructive, marks not only the country's release from post-colonial entanglements, but also its definitive entrance into the decolonial stage. Both the post-socialist and post-colonial conditions gradually evaporated from the territory of Ukraine after 2014, and the selfless yet harsh resistance of the Ukrainian people against the Russian invaders has shown that any other entanglements have also disappeared. Ukraine has become a Russian territory of desire, and Russia, in longing to occupy Ukraine, has in effect converted itself into Ukraine's invisible colony. Currently, it is Russia that persists in simultaneous colonial and anti-colonial stages, and has not yet reached the post-colonial condition, which is not possible to achieve without the removal of tyranny and the decentralization of power and institutions. This social and cultural divergence between the two countries is enormous. And though the outcomes for Ukraine are extremely painful, for Russia they will be fatal unless internal resistance brings the country to a more advanced post-colonial stage. Ukrainian determination toward decoloniality is expressed in recent artworks that reflect on the metamorphosis fostered by the rapid transition from what can be interpreted as a post-colonial state to decoloniality in the last 8 years. In Ukraine's particular decolonial case, Russia is no longer present as a political or cultural agent of impact. Among Ukrainians, there is a conscious collective position of distancing to avoid entanglement. The decolonial process of release in Ukraine carries on at an unprecedented pace, even as it goes through the flames of war and loss of heritage. We are yet to invent a new framework for interpreting and describing the decolonial state we find ourselves in, for it goes beyond any existing post-colonial or decolonial paradigm and requires a separate theory to be developed. Thank you.